The life of Ruby Rose. RWBY. Ruby Rose is the main protagonist of RWBY. She is a huntress, having been trained at the now-defunct Beacon Academy. Ruby's weapon of choice is her high-caliber sniper-scythe known as Crescent Rose, which she designed herself. Ruby first appeared in the Red trailer visiting the grave of her mother, Summer Rose. After an invitation from Professor Ozpin following a short battle with Roman Torchwick, Ruby attends Beacon Academy in order to become a huntress. During her time at Beacon, Ruby became a member and the leader of Team RWBY, consisting of herself, Weiss Schnee, Blake Belladonna, and her own elder half-sister, Xiao Long. However, following the fall of Beacon, Ruby travels to Haven Academy as a member of Team Ranger, with the remaining members of Team Juniper. After the Battle of Haven, Team RWBY is reunited again, and they continue to participate in the war against Salem and her forces. Following a battle with Neopolitan in the central location, RWBY was dropped into the void by Cinder Fall, and ended in what appears to be a beach-like dimension. Welcome to the Amagi. In today's video, we're going over the life of Ruby Rose. Before we begin, we publish a new video every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. The Amagi's reach stretches beyond just this channel, so if you're a fan of us, please consider subscribing to our other channels and following us on all our social media. Help us reach our goal of passing 100,000 followers on all of our accounts by the end of the year. And with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Background. Ruby is the daughter of Summer Rose and Xiao Long, as well as the younger half-sister of Xiao Long, with whom she was raised on the island of Patch. When she was young, Yang would read Ruby fairy tales every night before bed, filled with the deeds of great heroes. This would later inspire Ruby to become a huntress. One day, Summer went missing while on a mission. Yang said that, although Ruby was really torn up by the incident, she was too young to really understand what had happened. Shortly after Summer's disappearance, Yang brought Ruby with her to an abandoned building in order to find clues about the whereabouts of Yang's mother, Raven Bronwyn. During the search, they're almost killed by a Beowulfs, but were saved by their uncle, Crow Bronwyn, which only fueled Ruby's desire to become a huntress. To achieve this, she studied at Signal Academy, where she built and learned to use her high-caliber sniper-scythe, Crescent Rose, under the tutelage of her uncle Crow. Ruby trains with Yang to improve her hand-to-hand combat skills. Ruby complains about the training, but Yang insists. Ruby tries to fight Yang, but is easily overpowered and is forced to escape into the bushes with her semblance. As she wakes up, she spots an Ursa that fought her sister. It tries to attack her, but Yang manages to take the blow and finish off the Ursa, telling Ruby that she will always have her back. Ruby Rose is seen visiting an altar by a cliffside in a snow-laden forest, whose inscription reads, "Summer Rose, thus kindly I scatter," which is a reference to the poem The Last Rose of Summer by Thomas Moore. On her way back, she is confronted by a pack of Beowulfs, which she quickly kills before continuing on her way. While in Vytal, Ruby unexpectedly encounters her sister Yang outside of a club. Yang is somewhat reluctant to discuss what she's doing there, claiming that it's a long story. Dust Shop Robbery. Ruby becomes inadvertently involved in the affairs of the criminal Roman Torchwick when she interferes with his attempted robbery of the dust store from dusk till dawn. After quickly defeating all of his armed henchmen, Ruby gives chase to Roman as he flees to a nearby rooftop. There, she finds herself out of her depth when Roman's bullhead arrives to pick him up. It was only the intervention of Glinda that prevented Ruby from being harmed when Roman detonated a dust crystal at her feet with a shot from Melodic Cudgel. The pilot of the bullhead, Cinder Fall, swaps places with Roman in order to cover their escape. After trading several blows, Cinder successfully distracts Glinda by forcing her to save Ruby from harm, giving Roman enough time to fly away. Unhappy with that turn of events, Glinda briefly scolds Ruby in a remote location for her foolhardy risk-taking behavior, before admitting she was brought here for another reason. That reason was to meet Professor Ozpin, the headmaster of Beacon Academy where Glinda taught, who has seen Ruby's actions on camera and has a couple of questions for her. After being briefly distracted by Ruby's unusual eye color, Ozpin questions her skills with the scythe and quickly draws out her association with Crow in Signal Academy, as well as her dream to join Beacon in order to become a Huntress. Impressed by the girl's ambitions and values, he exercises his authority as the headmaster to accept her into the school 2 years early, much to the delight of RWBY's sister, Yang. Welcome to Beacon. After arriving at Beacon, Yang separates from her sister after meeting some of her friends, leaving RWBY to her own devices. She immediately gets herself in trouble by falling onto a luggage trolley belonging to Weiss. Dismayed at the possibility of damage to her supply of dust, Weiss immediately begins to berate RWBY, but in the process shakes enough dust into the air that it makes RWBY sneeze, detonating the drifting dust in a flash of fire, electricity, and ice. Before their conversation escalates into a full-blown argument, they are interrupted by Belladonna, who infuriates Weiss by mentioning the less-than-savory reputation of her family company, the Schnee Dust Company. Eventually, Blake and Weiss depart, leaving a depressed RWBY alone. She is not alone for long enough, though, as she is helped to her feet by Jean, who she previously saw being sick on the airship carrying them to Beacon. Despite a few rocky moments, during which they exchange unflattering nicknames, the two strike up a friendship and part ways on amicable terms when they reach Beacon's amphitheater. There, RWBY attempts to explain her day's misadventures to a disbelieving Yang. However, RWBY is interrupted from her explanation by Weiss, who scares RWBY into Yang's arms and makes her realize RWBY's tale was completely untrue. RWBY tries to make peace with Weiss to no avail before they get distracted by a speech from the headmaster and subsequently go their separate ways. That night in the Academy's ballroom, RWBY attempts to write a letter to her friends at Signal Academy about her day. However, Yang, eager to help her sister make friends, interrupts and drags her over to Blake to formally introduce herself. The two strike up a conversation about books and RWBY's dream for her future before Weiss arrives and starts berating everyone over the amount of noise they're causing. A dismayed Blake blows out her candles, leaving the quartet in the dark. Beacon Academy Initiation. The morning of their second day at Beacon, Yang notes that RWBY was awfully chipper, and RWBY explains that she was happy that she no longer is going to have to struggle socially, but could let Crescent Rose speak for her. It's clear that RWBY does not like the thought of making friends and wants to stick with Yang, even joining her team if necessary. She becomes angry when Yang suggests that making friends would help her break out of her shell and grow up emotionally. On the Beacon cliff, RWBY reacts with dismay when the class is informed by Glinda that they would be sorted into teams by the Academy faculty and not by their own choice. Ozpin makes this worse by stating that their partner for the rest of their time at Beacon was down to a combination of chance and their judgment. After being launched into the Emerald Forest, RWBY searches unsuccessfully for Yang before finally coming across Weiss, who promptly walks away and leaves RWBY behind. Although initially dismayed, RWBY is determined to make the team up work and is overjoyed when Weiss returns to her after initially storming away. RWBY starts attempting to impress Weiss, first with her speed and then with her ability as a fighter when they encounter a pack of Beowulfs. However, RWBY jumps in front of Weiss to attack the lead Beowulf, causing Weiss to hastily redirect the fire-based attack she was about to use on the Grimm, starting a small forest fire. RWBY gets frustrated at their having to flee the resulting fire, and Weiss accuses RWBY of being the strongest child to sneak her way into Beacon, an accusation that clearly infuriates RWBY. During their journey through the forest, where they get hopelessly lost, the two argue repeatedly. Weiss accuses RWBY of being childish, irresponsible, and by far her inferior. RWBY counters that Weiss is bossy and clearly thinks that she's perfect, an accusation that clearly bites deeply. Finally, RWBY somehow talks Weiss into a scheme that leads to the two dangling from a giant Nevermore high over the ruined temple at the north of the forest that was their objective. RWBY jumps off of the Grimm, leaving a furious Weiss still dangling from the creature. RWBY is inadvertently saved from a painful landing in front of Yang and Blake when Jean, who had been flung into the air by a Deathstalker, strikes her in mid-air, knocking them both into the trees. After recovering, RWBY sees the Deathstalker attacking Pyrrha, and RWBY runs to her aid. However, the giant scorpion-like Grimm is able to resist both Crescent Rose's blade and its rifle fire with no apparent damage. RWBY flees but is trapped when the Nevermore pins her cape to the ground with a barrage of spear-like feathers. She is only saved from being killed by the Deathstalker's sting when Weiss traps the creature's tail in ice. Weiss, now more upset than angry, repeats her charge that RWBY is immature and reckless, but acknowledges that her own acerbic personality is not helping matters. She offers to act nicer if RWBY stops showing off. RWBY responds that she merely wanted to prove to Weiss that she could take care of herself. Weiss's response, "You're fine," is an enormous relief to RWBY. She then has an emotional reunion with Yang before she collects the White Knight relic from the temple, completing the first part of the initiation test. She supports Weiss's declaration that they needed to make haste back to the cliffs to finish the test rather than dilly-dally around, fighting the Grimm. RWBY, Weiss, Blake, Yang, Jean, Nora Valkyrie, Pira Nikos, and Li Ren flee deeper into the abandoned temple buildings and are finally trapped between the Nevermore and the Deathstalker on a bridge across a seemingly bottomless abyss. After she, Weiss, Blake, and Yang make a few futile attempts to kill the Nevermore, RWBY comes up with a plan to combine the various skills and abilities of all four girls. Yang and Weiss cooperate to freeze the Nevermore's tail to the ground. Blake and Yang create an enormous slingshot from the ribbon of the Gamble Shroud. Weiss uses a glyph to launch RWBY from it, pinning the Nevermore's neck to the cliff with Crescent Rose's blade, and ascends the cliff, aided by her weapon's recoil and Weiss's powers. Finally, at the top of the cliff, a final shot from Crescent Rose beheads the Nevermore. That evening, back in the amphitheater, Professor Ozpin announces that RWBY, Weiss, Blake, and Yang, having all selected a White Knight relic, would henceforth work together as Team RWBY. Much to RWBY's shock, Weiss's disbelief, and Yang's joy, RWBY is named team leader. Manga. The manga opens with the events of the Red trailer. These are revealed to be a flashback as the scene transitions from RWBY standing next to her mother's memorial to her waiting for the remaining members of Team RWBY to show up near Beacon Academy. Once everyone comes, the team heads to the cafeteria, where they chat about the nature and uses of dust, before being interrupted by Cardin Winchester throwing Jean Arc into their table. Cardin then begins antagonizing RWBY, who had stepped in to defend Jean, before they're interrupted by Professor Glinda Goodwitch. Glinda decides to resolve the situation through a public sparring match, which ends up being spectated by numerous students as well as Professor Ozpin. RWBY initially freezes up due to the large audience present and the threat of the executioner, but is brought to her senses by Weiss Schnee. During the fight, RWBY reminisces on the time she was saved by her Uncle Crow. The spar ends with RWBY as the winner and, in honor of her uncle, opts to don her cloak along with her school uniform from now on. Start of classes. The next morning, RWBY, taking her role as team leader most seriously, rallies her team with a whistle to the task of unpacking and decorating their dormitory room. After getting the room in order and creating bunk beds to save space, Weiss realizes their first class begins in 5 minutes, causing Team RWBY and Team Juniper to engage in a sprint across the courtyard to class, watched by a dismayed Glinda and an amused Ozpin. RWBY pays little attention to the opening lecture of the Grimm Studies class, taught by Peter Port, after it becomes clear that the teacher just wishes to boast of his heroic past. RWBY's lackadaisical attitude enrages Weiss, who inadvertently volunteers to demonstrate the skills a Huntress needs by fighting a Borbotusk Professor Port had brought along for the occasion. Weiss struggles against the Grimm Boar, primarily because she keeps pausing to berate RWBY for distracting her and telling her what to do, despite RWBY actively trying to give her advice and encouragement. RWBY confronts her teammate after the fight, demanding an explanation. Weiss rages at RWBY and tells her that she's unfit to be a leader in terms of her youth and lack of skill. A dismayed RWBY crosses paths with Ozpin, who, after being asked by RWBY if he made a mistake, informs her he has made more mistakes than anyone else on Remnant, but that he does not believe that making RWBY team leader is one of them. Ozpin counsels RWBY that being a leader is a badge and a burden she must bear always, and that she needs to prove herself worthy of it. She cannot expect to lead if she does not show herself worthy of being followed. That night, RWBY falls asleep while studying, and Weiss wakes her up, impressed by her work ethic. Weiss informs RWBY of her intent to be the best teammate she can be and gives RWBY a coffee and a tip on her studies as peace offerings. Before leaving, she confesses she always wanted a bunk bed. As classes progress for a few weeks, RWBY watches a fight between Jean and Cardin. After the match, Glinda announces the Vytal Festival, and RWBY is excited to fight teams from other schools. RWBY later joins Team Juniper for a meal and questions if Jean is okay after his humiliating defeat at the hands of the bully Cardin. One night, RWBY runs into Jean outside his room, thinking he locked himself from it. Jean admits to RWBY his problems with Cardin and Pirha, but RWBY gives him some advice about being a leader and how, as a leader, Jean needs to put his team before himself, and how he is not allowed to fail because of it. She believes that Jean could be a great leader and leaves Jean in the hall to think about it. The next day, RWBY and her team go on a field trip to Forever Fall to collect red sap from the local trees. Everything goes well until an Ursa attacks Jean and Cardin. RWBY orders Yang and Blake to get Glinda while Weiss, Pyrrha, and herself go to save Jean. Pyrrha tells them to wait as Jean fights the Ursa, helping him slightly with her semblance. RWBY asks what Pyrrha did, and Pyrrha explains that she has the power of polarity, which RWBY mistakes as the power to control poles. Weiss promptly corrects her that it means controlling magnetism. The three then leave Cardin and Jean alone and walk back to rejoin the groups. Team divided. In order to prepare for the upcoming Vytal Festival, Weiss convinces the team to head to the docks to see the other teams. While there, the team investigates a robbery at a dust shop. Weiss and Blake begin to fight about the White Fang's possible involvement in the robbery, but RWBY sides with Blake that it probably was not them and wonders if it was Roman, as the Vale Police Department never caught him from the robbery at From Dusk Till Dawn. Just then, Sun Wukong runs off a nearby boat, and the group gives chase at Weiss's insistence. During the chase, Weiss knocks over a girl named Penny. As they talk, RWBY calls her a friend before leaving around the corner. As Team RWBY talks about the strange girl, Penny appears in front of them and asks RWBY if she really meant that they're friends. Despite everyone signaling to RWBY to not say yes, she does anyway, and Penny is overjoyed. The meeting turns sour when Weiss and Blake begin fighting over the White Fang and faunas in general, forcing RWBY and Yang to watch them fight well into the night. However, when Blake accidentally admits her previous affiliation with the White Fang and runs off, RWBY tries and fails to stop her. The team searches for Blake later in the weekend. RWBY and Yang shout for Blake while Weiss walks and does nothing. Shortly after Penny appears, Yang and Weiss leave her alone with RWBY, much to RWBY's annoyance. RWBY and Penny spend the rest of the day talking, mostly on Blake and friendship. During the night, the two girls hear and follow an explosion. After seeing Roman caused it, RWBY calls herself out to him from a rooftop, and he shoots RWBY while she's distracted. Despite RWBY's fear for Penny's well-being, Penny goes on to fight. After Roman escapes, Team RWBY is reunited, and RWBY notices Penny's absence. Beginning the second semester. Before the second semester begins, RWBY compiles a large binder of ideas for how she and her team can have the best day ever. She then meets them in the dining hall and begins to explain to them her idea, despite Nora and Yang flinging food at each other. This eventually escalates into a full-scale food fight between RWBY's team and Juniper. RWBY leads her team into the charge, but eventually, everyone on her team is incapacitated. As a final attack, RWBY uses her semblance to create a wind vortex that sucks up all the loose food, plates, and soda in the dining hall and dashes past Juniper, forcing them against the back wall. She then jumps out of the way as they're hit with the airborne food and soda, covering them entirely. As Glinda barges into the room and sets everything right, RWBY is seen laughing with everyone else. RWBY plays a board game with her teammates, but she and Weiss lose to her sister. After Sun arrives and introduces them to his friend, Neptune Vasilius, Blake leaves. Later that day, RWBY returns to her dorm with Yang and Weiss. After Weiss stops Blake from leaving, pointing out her recent behavior, RWBY asks Blake if she's still thinking about Roman. Blake answers affirmatively and states that she has also thought of the White Fang, and the discussion continues on about how nobody knows about what's going on. After a lengthy conversation, RWBY formulates a plan for the four to take down the enemies that are conspiring against them, and all agree. As she begins to formulate a plan, RWBY suddenly remembers leaving her board game in the library and rushes out to get it, but she bumps into Emerald Sustrai and Mercury Black. She also meets Cinder again, although she's not aware she fought her during the From Dusk Till Dawn robbery. RWBY then redirects them to where they're supposed to go. Cinder thanks her and says they will meet again. RWBY agrees and shouts, "Welcome to Beacon!" RWBY Investigations. Following Peter Port's class, RWBY is with their team in their dorm, changing their clothes into their alternate outfits. After going over their plans, the team leader is surprised by Sun, who agrees alone to join them, and RWBY tells him she does not want to get friends involved. He objects, having Neptune join him as well. After pairing Neptune with Yang and Sun with Blake, RWBY heads out with Weiss. She pulls away Weiss after rejecting her idea of working with Neptune. The pair is then seen talking about the Cross-Continental Transmit System Center when they bump into Penny. When Ruby asks Penny where she's been, she runs away, and Ruby goes after her, leaving Weiss alone, but not before telling her that they would meet up later. After running around with Penny and asking her several questions, they're spotted by 2 Atlas soldiers, prompting Penny to run away with Ruby running behind her. Ruby aids her by cutting off a scaffolding, causing boxes to fall, blocking the soldiers' passageway. Using her speed, Ruby grabs Penny in flight but soon loses control, crashing to the floor, dropping Penny, and causing Ruby herself to land onto the street. Before she's hit by an oncoming truck, Penny saves her in the nick of time and stops the truck with her bare hands, lifting it up, visibly shocking Ruby. Penny runs away again. After catching up to her once more, Ruby again asks Penny what's wrong. She tells Penny that she can trust her and assures her that they're friends. Penny then reveals to Ruby her metallic hands and that she is not a normal girl, leaving Ruby surprised once again. After learning about Penny's true self, Ruby surprises her by saying that it matters not to her if she's a robot, because all that matters is that she has a heart and a soul, something she herself can feel. Penny hugs Ruby in joy and then hides her in a garbage dump after hearing the 2 Atlas soldiers. Sometime later, Ruby responds to Blake's distress call, pointing out how she would not miss the fight with the Atlesian Paladin 290. She then joins her team in a fight against Roman, who is piloting the large robot. After a long fight, the robot is destroyed by Yang, resulting in the escape of their enemies. After Weiss makes a small joke, Ruby snickers, although Yang and Blake were not particularly pleased with the joke. Aftermath in the dance. Ruby is seen with their team observing a fight between Pyria and Team Cardinal, where Pyria emerges victorious. When Mercury decides to challenge Pyria immediately afterward, Ruby offers praise in regards to his skills to Emerald. Later that day, Ruby and her team show concern for Blake, who has not slept in days, has barely eaten, and has allowed her grades to drop significantly. When her team attempts to help her, Blake brushes them off and leaves, telling them that she will be in the library. Ruby, Yang, and Weiss then stare in shock as Jean shows up at their dorm, attempting to invite Weiss to the dance, only to get shot down. A depressed Ruby is seen sitting on a chair whilst her teammates prepare for the dance. When Weiss asks Ruby which tablecloth they should use, the team leader asks if both are the same, with Weiss answering on why she even asked. When Yang asks Ruby what's wrong, Ruby says that she has no more ideas on how to get Blake to come to the dance. Yang reassures her and Weiss that Blake is going. The next day, an embarrassed Ruby enters the ballroom, with Yang commenting on how beautiful she is. She complains about the shoes and how it is impossible for Weiss to fight in such footwear. Following this, with Weiss and Yang heading their way to have fun, Ruby has a small conversation with Ozpin, who points out that one can never spend all their time on the battlefield, and that both dancing and fighting are exactly the same, and that she should take the time to have fun. He comments that as time goes on, friendships can be tested, but it's opportunities at events like these which can strengthen those bonds and why they are remembered. Ruby is seen alone drinking from a cup and is later joined by Jean, who adds on how both of them are alone. When Jean asks about Weiss, she informs him that she came alone, which upsets him, knowing that she had asked Neptune to the dance. She is then seen talking with her sister, who headlocks her, only to tell her to try and have fun. Ruby later notices Cinder sneaking around and decides to follow her. After giving chase and seeing what she did to several guards, Ruby confronts her in a small fight, but Cinder escapes, leaving her alone in the cross-continental transmit system as James Ironwood arrives. The Mountain Glen Mission. Ruby arrives at Ozpin's office, where the headmaster, Ironwood, and Glinda are waiting for her. They then begin to talk about the events of the previous night, in which Ruby recollects the events of Cinder. However, she points out that she does not recognize the assailant due to her mask, but brought up her abilities. Glinda notes the glass-based abilities described by Ruby were similar to the woman she fought when they first met Ruby. After Ironwood praises Ruby for her actions, Ozpin asks Ruby to keep their conversation secret, which she agrees to. She is then confronted by her team upon her arrival to her dorm room, to which she eventually tells them of the events of last night. While Weiss believed her actions to have been rather risky, Blake says that Ruby handled it right, as Yang tries to comfort her sister by telling her that everything would be alright. In an effort to cheer her up, Yang reveals to RWBY a package delivered to them from their father. After opening up the package and revealing to be their dog, Zwei, RWBY is overjoyed, along with Yang and her partner Weiss, who was skeptical at first, while Blake hid up on the top of RWBY's bed. After Glinda calls all first-year students to the assembly hall, RWBY heads over with her team, where Ozpin gives a speech on how 80 years ago to the day, the biggest war ended. Following the speech, RWBY and her team head to a selection of missions called Search and Destroy, and all choose Quadrant 5, Clear Out Grimm, but are unable to, due to it being unavailable for first-year students. However, Ozpin, after pointing out some of RWBY's past actions, along with her team, he bends the rules and enlists them in their selection. Following a short conversation with Team Coffee's Velvet Scarlatina, RWBY presses on how they never back down from a challenge, and that they cannot do it now. Blake agrees, and RWBY brings up that it will be not just them, but also that they will fight alongside a genuine huntsman. Unfortunately, RWBY and her team are left in utter shock upon seeing that Bartholomew Oobleck was the one joining them. As the team still remains in shock upon Oobleck being their shadowing huntsman, he informs them of their mission and then rushes off to the ship. Team Juniper meets up with Team RWBY, who begins talking about their mission, Quadrant 5, just as Sun and Neptune arrive, in which they also talk about their job. After Oobleck calls for the team, Sun, Neptune, and Team Juniper give Yang and her team a sympathetic look and then part ways. Once aboard the ship, Oobleck tells Weiss that despite being intellectual, he has had his share of tussles as a huntsman, which RWBY mistakes for truffles and Brussels sprouts. Oobleck brings up how the southeast quadrant of Vale is the site of the kingdom's greatest failure, where RWBY answers Mountain Glen, as Yang adds on to it with being an expansion having been overrun by creatures of Grimm and was fenced off from the rest of the city. Once they arrive, after discovering that RWBY had brought the dog, something which Oobleck is grateful for, they are ordered to dispatch a group of Beowulfs, which they do for the rest of the day. Later, RWBY accompanies Oobleck to scout the perimeter as her team sets up camp. When they reach the edge of the destroyed city, she notices Grimm in the distance, which Oobleck tells her are Goliaths. When she wants to attack them, Oobleck says her sniper rifle would just agitate them. The two of them get into another discussion where RWBY asks Oobleck why he became a huntsman. He tells her he chose his career to save people, and when he looks at the ruins of the city, he looks and wonders about the people that could have been saved. Around nighttime, the two return to the campsite and RWBY volunteers to take night watch. When heading out, Yang asks RWBY if Oobleck asked for the reason RWBY became a huntress, and RWBY says that she was not asked and heads out. As her team lays in their beds behind her, RWBY keeps watch with Zwei as Beowulfs are heard in the distance, and RWBY comforts her dog. RWBY falls asleep as Yang takes watch and is awoken when Zwei runs out, prompting her to go after him without alerting her team. After catching up to her pet, she hears two White Fang members and follows them to their base. RWBY attempts to return to her team and alert them, but the street caves in, and she falls through. Zwei returns to the team and alerts them of RWBY's misfortune. RWBY lands in what appears to be an underground village, and is confronted by the two same guards she saw earlier and fails to fight back before being knocked out. The guards bring her to Roman. When asked how she found them, she uses her semblance to attempt to escape, but fails when Roman uses his weapons hook to grapple her. Explosions occur in the distance, and it's revealed to be Oobleck and the rest of her team. Using an open opportunity, RWBY jumps on Roman, covers his eyes with his own hat, and begins to run, managing to evade the shots being fired at her. She's cornered by 4 White Fang members, but Yang saves her. She jumps into Yang's arms and tells her team of the White Fang's actions. Roman and the White Fang flee on a train. Given no other choice, RWBY and the others board the train. They discover several bombs on the train that are set to explode, so each car would detach from the train and explode to create holes in the ceiling of the tunnel for the Grimm to enter. After they take out several henchmen atop the train, RWBY and Oobleck work together to eliminate the Atlesian Paladin 290 and try to reach the front car. However, as they reach the front car and rejoin with the rest of the team, they realize the train's about to reach the end of the tunnel with no way to stop it. Weiss encompasses the group in a barrier of ice before the train collides and bursts upward into the center of Vale. Recovering from the crash, RWBY hears the city's emergency sirens blare as a horde of Grimm emerges and terrorizes the city from within. Team RWBY regroups at the center plaza as they're surrounded by Grimm from all sides. Each team member engages the Grimm, with RWBY at one point anchoring her Crescent Rose into the ground and spin-stomping attacking Grimm from around her. Eventually, Oobleck joins the fight with teams Juniper and Coffee, Sun, Neptune, Emerald, Mercury, the Atlesian forces, and other Beacon professors arriving to contain the swarm of Grimm. After securing the breach in the city and disposing of the invading Grimm, Team RWBY returned to Beacon to assess the events of the past 2 days. Though RWBY is still concerned about being unable to resolve all the lingering questions and mysteries surrounding their investigation thus far. With dawn rising, she suggests the team get some sleep, and all agree. Vytal Festival Tournament. Shortly before the Vytal Festival Tournament begins, RWBY returns to the cliffside forest to visit Summer Rose's grave. She talks about her father, Xiao Long, and how he has started to go on missions again, and that she thinks he misses adventuring with her. She also talks about how Yang is on her team at Beacon, and how she has become a great fighter. She speaks about how her new teammates, Weiss and Blake, how she has made many new friends and met some odd teachers, and how she has stopped some bad guys, pausing to remark on the similarity between mother and daughter. She also wonders momentarily why Ozpin let her into Beacon, and how he reminds her of her Uncle Crow. She then gets called away by Taeyang, who is about to leave on another mission. She joins him, and he drops her off at Vale, where the tournament is due to begin. At the enormous floating stadium Amity Coliseum, Team RWBY's first match in the tournament is with Team Auburn of Haven Academy. After an action-packed match, Team RWBY emerges victorious, and the team heads to the Beacon Fairgrounds to get a meal. There, they meet Emerald, who returns RWBY's wallet, claiming that she had dropped it. Emerald praises Team RWBY's performance, much to RWBY's delight. RWBY ends up eating at a noodle store run by the shopkeep, where RWBY orders a huge bowl. There they are joined by Juniper, before the latter head off to their next match in the tournament. RWBY and her team follow Juniper over to the stadium, taking their place in the spectator stands to cheer their friends on. During the match between Team Juniper and Team Bronze, she cheers Jean on. After the match between Team Sun and Team Indigo, she is relieved that Sun won. As Team RWBY leaves the stadium, RWBY bumps into Weiss as the latter sees Winter Schnee's airship arriving in Beacon. Weiss takes off after her sister's ship, and RWBY hurries after her. RWBY and Weiss meet Winter at Beacon's courtyard. After Winter declines to answer a couple of Weiss's questions, yet asks of her sister's well-being, Winter thanks RWBY for taking an interest in friendship with Weiss. RWBY notices the formalities in the sisters' speaking, and she stops herself from being too informal. This leads to pauses as she searches for words and a loss of balance as she tries to curtsy. She bids the sisters well and heads off just when Crow arrives at Beacon. As Crow and Winter fight, Weiss tells RWBY that a crazy person is attacking her sister. When RWBY realizes he is her uncle, she disregards Weiss's claim and instantly cheers on her family member. RWBY leaps into Crow's arm after his fight and repeatedly asks if he missed her. He says nope before affectionately messing with her hair. Ozpin calls Crow to his office, and Crow wishes RWBY well with a wink and a fist bump. Weiss notes how similar RWBY is to her uncle. RWBY says Weiss is only mad because of how well Crow did against her sister, and Weiss calls the match a draw at best. RWBY, Yang, and their uncle are later in Team RWBY's dorm, taking turns playing a two-player fighting game. RWBY asks why Crow is at Beacon when his mission was supposed to take longer. He tells RWBY and Yang of his most recent mission, as well as with Team Stark, of which he used to belong. While he admires their actions as Huntresses, he also reminds them that his nieces and their friends cannot stop all crime in Vale. RWBY finds Penny after the latter's victory against Team Cardinals Russell Thrush and Skylark. She is introduced to Penny's acquaintance, Cel Soleil, who already knows much about RWBY. Penny asks Ciel for a minute to talk with RWBY, and Ciel obliges. RWBY asks if Ciel knows Penny is a robot, and Penny denies the claim. She reasons that General Ironwood does not want anyone to find her out. She recalls getting a magnet stuck to her head, but she was able to cover it. The two laugh over the situation. Penny tells RWBY she has a plan to stay at Beacon, though Ironwood and her father are likely not to allow her. Ciel calls Penny to leave, and RWBY goes to the stands to watch Weiss and Yang fight Flint Cole and Neon Cat of Team Funky. After Weiss and Yang win and the former is charred, RWBY and Blake come to her side and congratulate them. As Yang is chosen at random to fight Mercury in the singles round, RWBY, Weiss, and Blake cheer her on from the stands. RWBY tells her sister to break a leg, wishing her well. Yang wins the fight. However, after the fight, RWBY and everyone watching see Yang break Mercury's leg, apparently without provocation. RWBY and her team are speechless, unaware that Yang actually saw Mercury attacking her first. RWBY is later seen comforting Yang along with Weiss and Blake in their dorm. Ironwood is with them and states no matter what really happened previously, Yang was seen attacking an innocent student without provocation and is therefore disqualified. Despite the popular belief, RWBY is still quick to rally at her sister's side along with Weiss. After leaving Yang alone in their dorm, the three meet Juniper outside their dorm. RWBY then informs them that Mercury, along with his own team, rushed back to Mistral to meet up with the family and will be therefore unreachable. RWBY supports Pyrrha and wishes her good luck in the singles round. RWBY later then meets Velvet at the airship docks. Velvet states her concern for Yang as well and dislikes ill nudes towards her, which RWBY appreciates. She also tells RWBY that Coco experienced the same sort of hallucination her match against Emerald and Mercury. RWBY was off-put by this information and begins to have suspicions. RWBY then gets a seat in Amity Coliseum before the match starts, but is then agape when she spots Emerald seated across the arena. This contradicts the information she was given. RWBY then leaves the Coliseum grandstands. Mercury then emerges before her, who, much to RWBY's surprise, looks completely unscathed. She's later horrified when she hears Professor Port announce the next match, Pyrrha against Penny. Mercury reveals he knows Penny's secret and acknowledges the havoc that will be caused due to Pyrrha's semblance. Beginning to catch on to the ruse, RWBY reaches to draw her weapon, only to find she did not bring it. Mercury takes a fighting stance, leaving RWBY to face him alone. While Pyrrha and Penny's match progresses, RWBY becomes ensnared in a losing conflict against Mercury, and does her best to escape and warn her friends. RWBY is too late in getting back to the grandstands, falling to her knees and crying when seeing Penny torn apart before Pyrrha in an international audience. RWBY breaks down in tears when she sees Penny's dismembered remains in the arena. The Battle of Beacon. Initially frozen with shock and horror, she later sees Pyrrha and Jean in danger. In response, she grabs one of Floating Array's swords and stabs the Grim in an effort to defend the two. When Pyrrha apologizes, RWBY comes to terms with the ordeal and states that it's not her fault, but that of the conspirators causing the chaos. After receiving help from the other students, she requests Sunscroll to retrieve her weapon. When Port and Oobleck intervene, RWBY initially protests on them having to evacuate the stadium when the Griffins arrive, but she is swayed by their reasoning that they have to survive to tell history. Once the group gathers, RWBY agrees with Jean and Sun to defend Vale, heading to Beacon in an Airbus. However, once she sees Ironwood's craft fall from the sky, she returns to Amity by herself to propel herself on a locker all the way to Roman's stolen airship. Jumping onto the deck, RWBY watches as the Wyvern and several Griffin pass by her. One Griffin lands in front of her, and she defeats it, but it leaves her a little bit exhausted. Suddenly, Neopolitan appears behind RWBY and snaps a picture with her scroll, sending it to Roman and prompting him to go and fight RWBY. As she is being overpowered by the duo, RWBY asks why they're letting the Grim destroy everything, becoming shocked when she learns that is their plan. Roman and Neo overpower RWBY again, and she ends up hanging onto Crescent Rose on the edge of the airship. As Neo points her blade at her, RWBY notices a button on the umbrella and quickly pushes it, sending her opponent flying into a horde of Griffin. RWBY angrily proclaims that she and her allies will stop their enemies and charges at Roman. However, he counters her attack and beats her with his cane, proclaiming that he will survive while heroes like her will die. He is suddenly eaten alive by a Griffin, much to RWBY's horror. As the Grim moves to attack her, she dodges and kicks it into the hull of the ship. As the aircraft begins to fall, RWBY dashes to Crescent Rose and jumps off the ship. Firing bullets to slow her descent, she lands safely onto Beacon's landing pad and watches as the airship crashes into Vale. RWBY later regroups with Weiss, Sun, Blake, Yang, Nora, and Ren, and is devastated to see that Yang's right arm has been cut off. After realizing Jean and Pyrrha are still missing, she declares that she will bring them back, with Weiss accompanying her. As they arrive at the tower, they receive a call from Jean asking them to save Pyrrha. After defeating the surrounding Grim, Weiss propels her onto the walls of the tower so that she can save Pyrrha. Unfortunately, RWBY arrives too late, watching in horror as Cinder kills Pyrrha. She breaks down in despair and unleashes a power that engulfs both the Wyvern and Cinder in a blinding light. RWBY falls unconscious moments later and is rescued by Crow afterward. A new team and a new journey. She later wakes up in her home under the care of her father before Crow steps in to explain what transpired. He tells her she froze the Wyvern to the tower using a power that is indicated by her silver eyes, a rare trait that she shared with her mother. RWBY learns that she comes from a line of legendary warriors that Grimm fear. When RWBY wants to help Crow in completing Ozpin's work, he tells RWBY to recover first. Later, she visits Yang's room, where she learns that her team has been divided, as Weiss has returned to Atlas with her father and Blake fled. She is shocked and saddened by the news, even more so at how dispirited her older sister has become. Before leaving her broken sibling, she sadly relayed that she still loved her, but receives no reply. In the following winter, RWBY leaves her home without telling her father, having written a letter to him to explain her departure. Reuniting with Jean, Nora, and Ren, she journeys with them to Haven Academy in Mistral. Along the way, the four of them stop at Summer's gravestone, where RWBY pays her respects to her mother once again before departing on their great journey. Journey to Haven. Several months after her departure, RWBY comes across a village under attack from hordes of Grimm. She quickly moves into the village and makes short work of the Grimm attackers, slaying a fearsome Grimm known as a Berengal. Nearby, Jean, Ren, and Nora see smoke and contact her by scroll before rushing over to assist. Without waiting for them to arrive, RWBY eagerly continues her fight in the village alone. Sometime after that, RWBY manages to find her way to Mistral with the others. They help a village by hunting down and killing a Geist that had been plaguing them for weeks, in exchange for new armor for Jean and a modified Crocea Moors. Upon seeing the logo on Jean's hood, RWBY bursts into laughter as she sees it's a cute little bunny rabbit. As they head for the next village with high spirits, RWBY becomes somber at the mention of the Schnee Dust Company. Sometime later, RWBY has a strange dream where she hears Pirha's voice and wakes up startled. When she and her team arrive at Xi'an, they are shocked to find the town destroyed and its villagers dead. They learn from a dying huntsman that the village was attacked by bandits, and the panic attracted local Grimm. RWBY tries to comfort a distraught John, but he is devastated at another loss of life. Later, RWBY has the same dream again and wakes up in the middle of the night hearing Pirha's voice. Upon seeing Jean's sleeping bag empty, she discovers him training using a training video made by Pirha. After watching Jean train once and listening to Pirha's message to him, RWBY quietly slips away back to camp. RWBY and her friends then travel to Higanbana after she has trouble pronouncing its name, as I just did. They continue in high spirits, unaware that her Uncle Crow has protected them from a Grimm attack. That night, RWBY and her team make it to town and rest at the inn, and Crow watches them from a nearby tavern. Team Ranger sets out again to continue its journey to Haven. They come across Oniyuri, an incomplete village that was a failed attempt by people in Mistral to break away from the kingdom. RWBY and company continue on, but are ambushed by Tyrion Kalos, who declare his intention to take RWBY and overwhelms Team Ranger. RWBY's aura is depleted and she is incapacitated, but before Tyrion can land a critical strike on her, Crow appears and blocks the attack. RWBY learns from her uncle that Tyrion is working for Salem, and the two men begin to fight each other. Team Ranger tries to help, but Crow orders them to stay back. RWBY gets atop a roof and unsuccessfully fires at Tyrion from a distance. She decides to join in once the two fall into a building. Crow shouts at her to stay back, but she does not listen. Just as a wooden beam is about to fall on her, Crow saves her but gets grazed by Tyrion's stinger. RWBY quickly retaliates by cutting off the Faunus' tail, crippling him. After Tyrion quickly retreats, RWBY tends to her uncle. That night, RWBY and her friends learn from Crow about the Four Maidens, the deity brothers who created Remnant and the four relics that are hidden within the four academies. Afterward, RWBY asks her uncle as to why he was following her team discreetly and not joining them. He answers that he did not want a semblance of misfortune to harm her. The following morning, RWBY is horrified that Crow has been poisoned by Tyrion. A makeshift stretcher is used to carry Crow while they all continue on in the hopes of finding help for him. However, they're forced to make a difficult choice when encountering a fork in the road. Team Ranger splits. Ren and Nora take the mountainous path towards Mistral, while RWBY and Jean carry Crow through onto a level path that leads to a destroyed city. They both walk over the same symbol that was seen on the ground at Xi'an. RWBY and Jean are unable to locate medical supplies in Kuroyuri, and RWBY apologizes to Jean for getting him, Ren, and Nora involved in the journey. When their companions rejoin them, they are confronted by the Knuckleavi. RWBY helps bring the fight to an end by pinning one of the Knuckleavi's arms with her scythe, and once Ren slays it, the smoke that results from its disintegration catches the attention of pilots from Mistral who are on patrol. The pilots transport them to the city of Mistral, where Crow receives medical attention, the group finds a place to stay, and RWBY writes a letter to Yang. In Mistral, RWBY, along with Crow and the rest of Team Ranger, meets Professor Leonardo Lionheart, headmaster of Haven Academy. She learns of the connection between the maidens and the relics through their conversation about the Spring Maiden likely being with Yang's mother, Raven. Unable to go after her due to Lionheart's resistance, the group is left with no other choice but to wait. Later, she and the rest of her team meet Oscar Pine, who introduces himself as also being Professor Ozpin. Oscar gives Ozpin control of his body, and the former headmaster reveals the true nature of his being as a soul and memories transferred into Oscar after a long line of succession. Ozpin plans to train RWBY and the rest of her team, citing RWBY's poor hand-to-hand combat skills, so they can best ensure the safety of the Relic of Knowledge. RWBY, Oscar, and the rest of Team Ranger train outside. RWBY spars Oscar in hand-to-hand combat and wins because he never engaged his aura. When Ozpin controls Oscar's body, however, he easily bests RWBY after she uses incorrect footing. After the spar, Team Ranger discusses with Oscar about aura and semblance. When Jean laments that he had not discovered his powers yet, RWBY encourages him and Oscar, saying they will find their semblances in time. One night, RWBY finds Oscar training by himself with the long memory in the training room. She compliments him on his improvement and believes that he will be ready for combat soon. However, Oscar states that he is scared of fighting and even yells at RWBY for being calm with all of the chaos that is surrounding her. She's taken aback by his burst of anger, but she calmly tells him how she came to lose Penny and Pyrrha and the circumstances of their deaths. RWBY admits she's scared, but her biggest fear is that Salem will not only kill her opponents, but innocent bystanders as well. She states that she has to keep moving forward because she knows that Penny and Pyrrha would have done the same if she was the one to lose her life. Going back upstairs, RWBY acknowledges Oscar for his perseverance and bravery. On a later day, Team Ranger prepare a dinner for the huntsman Crow is searching for. When she heads for the house entrance upon her uncle's return, she is shocked to find Yang and Weiss with him. As her older sister approaches her, RWBY tries to apologize for leaving her back in Patch. However, Yang cuts her off with a hug and tearfully says, "I love you," which RWBY responds back. The sisters then invite Weiss to join in, and the girls share a heartfelt reunion. RWBY then has a ramen dinner with all of her friends, and they go over past events. She compliments Ren for being out of control during the battle with the Knuckleavi, and is later in awe of Yang's new robotic arm. Then they all have a talk with Ozpin, where it's revealed that he gave the Bronwyn twins the ability to turn into birds, and he was the wizard who gave the first maidens their magic. In the end, RWBY is worried that Yang is going to leave because Ozpin was keeping his secrets, but is later relieved when her older sister decides to stay due to her own influence. Waking up early the next morning, RWBY has coffee with Weiss and Yang and laments that Blake is not with them. She shows great concern for her sister when the latter states that she does not care for their teammate anymore. Later, RWBY finds Yang consolidating with Weiss and is relieved to later see her sister has calmed down. RWBY later talks to Ozpin and Crow alone about her worries for the Relic of Choice, as Cinder is the Fall Maiden who can access the relic. She is assured by Ozpin that Salem does not have that relic, as he has made it more difficult to find in Beacon. RWBY then asks about his cane, and she learns that although it is not a relic, it is still special to him. After Crow receives a call from Lionheart, RWBY is delighted to hear that there is a raiding party ready to find the Spring Maiden and rushes to fetch the others. The Battle of Haven. On the night of the full moon, RWBY and her allies travel to Haven to meet with Lionheart and unexpectedly encounter Raven. After hearing from her that no one can defeat Salem, RWBY argues with her, reasoning that they have achieved impossible feats because they work together. She then extends her hand and asks Raven to join them, but the response she receives is a surprise attack from Cinder through the bandits' portal. Soon after, the heroes find themselves surrounded by Salem's followers, and learn that both Lionheart and Raven had sided together with them. When Jean moves in to fight Cinder, RWBY rushes to help him but is stopped by Emerald. As the two battle, RWBY asks Emerald why she is serving Salem, only to find that Emerald does not care about Salem but owes Cinder everything. Upon seeing Jean and Cinder about to collide, RWBY remembers Pirha's death and cries out, unleashing her silver-eyed powers once more. However, Emerald knocks RWBY out and cuts her powers short. When she regains consciousness, RWBY finds Weiss incapacitated and treated by Jean. Upon seeing her other comrades in trouble, she directs Jean to keep treating Weiss, Nora to cover for them, and Ren to help Oscar and Crow against Lionheart and Hazel Reynard. RWBY then rushes to Yang's side and prepares to fight with her against Emerald and Mercury. RWBY fights Mercury and eventually headbutts him, telling him that she will do whatever it takes to shut him up. As the battle progresses, she finds that her allies are tired and worn out, but is later surprised when she hears the airships of the Mistral police outside. Suddenly, RWBY is shocked to find Blake outside. Remembering about the relic, she orders Yang to head for the vault. RWBY then turns and gives Blake a nod before the latter runs back outside. As the battle rages on, RWBY and Weiss are reunited with Blake once again after she stomps on Hazel. After stopping Lionheart from firing his dust projectiles and causing him to flee, RWBY directs her teammates for their coordinated attacks. Eventually, she pleads for Emerald, Mercury, and Hazel to stop fighting, as they are all worn out from the battle. When Yang returns with the relic, RWBY is relieved. But when Emerald breaks down at Cinder's apparent demise, the heroes are caught in an illusion confronting a giant Salem. This leaves RWBY utterly terrified, and Ozpin later confirms that it was an illusion of their true enemy. After the battle, RWBY collapses from exhaustion, and later asks Blake what she was doing in Haven. With all four of them together once again, the girls share a hug of reunion as Team RWBY is reformed. Journey to Atlas. Recovering back at the Manor, RWBY and her friends learn more about the Relic of Knowledge from Ozpin, discovering that it can answer 3 questions every 100 years. As they now know what it does, RWBY assures Ozpin that they will keep the relic safe. 2 weeks after the Battle of Haven, RWBY and the rest of her friends go to a train station to board the Argus Limited, which would take them to Argus, a city in Anima on the way to the Kingdom of Atlas. She buys Yang something from the gift shop, and when aboard the train, calls for an official team exercise. Video games. Manticore and Sphinx Grim disrupt it, however, and the heroes climb atop the train to fight them. A tunnel interrupts the battle, and after seeing the scared passengers, RWBY stops her uncle from attempting to force Dudley to deactivate the turrets on the train, and politely pleads with them to turn off the turrets. When tension rises again as Ozpin reveals that the Grimm are attracted to the relics, RWBY stops Yang from arguing with Ozpin and devises a plan to split the team up, and later promises Jean that she and their allies will meet Team Juniper in Argus. Everyone agrees, and Jean, Ren, and Nora take the front cars and all the passengers safely to Argus. Team RWBY, Crow, and Oscar stay in the detached rear cars with the Relic of Knowledge to fight the Grimm. Though they defeat all the Grimm, the Sphinx spits a fireball at the tracks, derailing the train and leaving RWBY's group in a snowy forest. Maria Calavera, an old woman who happened to stay in the rear cars, comes out and greets them. RWBY finds the relic in the snow and holds onto it, later showing it to Ozpin that it is safe. When he orders her to give it to him, she asks if his faith in humanity does not apply to her and her teammates. Oscar fights back for control and tells RWBY to summon the being within the relic, whose name is Jin. After RWBY says the name, she is awestruck as time stops around her and the being emerges from the relic. Jin reveals that she can answer 2 questions, and RWBY goes against Ozpin's pleas, asking the being, "What is Ozpin hiding from us?" She is startled when Ozpin charges at her, but then finds herself alone on an alternate plane. As Jin tells everyone the answer in a fairy tale form, they learn that Salem was once human. After learning of Salem and Ozpin's past and that Ozpin cannot kill his former lover, RWBY stares down angrily at him and asks if he has a plan to defeat Salem. After he admits that he has no plan, Ozpin loses everyone's faith and seals himself within Oscar's mind. The tension in the group rises until Maria steps in and tells everyone to calm down. As the heroes are directed to follow a nearby trail, RWBY gives the long memory to Oscar. She tries to assure him that he is his own person, but her efforts are thwarted by Crow, who tells her not to lie to Oscar. Later on the trail, RWBY and her allies find a farm estate which looks abandoned. Despite its appearance, the heroes venture in for shelter from the snowstorm. The Nightmare of Brunswick Farms. As they try to get inside the main house, RWBY states her confusion as the previous empty towns she passed through were either damaged or unfinished. After they break their way through, she looks at the family pictures and tells Blake that something does not feel right. When they hear Weiss's scream, they hurry to the master bedroom and find a pair of partially decomposed corpses on the bed. As they later gather around the fire, they learn from Crow that everyone else on the estate suffered the same fate. RWBY deduces that there should be supplies for them to use. She later takes Weiss with her to find food for them to eat. The pair finds a wine cellar, and RWBY suggests that they close it away from Crow, for she's worried about her uncle after Jin's revelation of Ozpin's lies and secrets. She is further concerned for Weiss, who finds the goal of getting the Relic of Knowledge to Atlas pointless. They find and bring canned food back to the group. That night, RWBY is once again worried about her uncle as he drinks while taking watch, and the next day, RWBY discovers that Crow drank himself to sleep. In her anger, she awakens him by throwing and smashing a bottle into the wall. She hugs her uncle and later opens up for him, only for him to shrug her off. Later, RWBY and Crow are securing the flatbed to Bumblebee when Crow's semblance flattens one of the tires. She argues against her teammates about the mission of getting the Relic of Knowledge to Atlas, all of them arguing that they're better off leaving the lamp at the bottom of the nearby well so that Salem might have a hard time finding it. With her teammates standing against her, RWBY slowly walks over to the well to drop the relic, but she ultimately rejects the idea and is about to retreat her hand when a pair of eyes catch her off guard, causing her to drop the lamp down the well. As RWBY panics, her teammates' indifference arouses her anger, and she shouts at everyone that she is not leaving without the relic. After convincing her team, they go down the well together to search for the relic. As she finds the lamp, RWBY finds a horde of apathy and screams in terror. She then runs back to her team and fires at the Grimm, but the bullets do no apparent damage, and the Grimm's shrieks make the teams feel heavy and tired. Maria finds them, and they run through the tunnels, making their way to the wine cellar, the door of which is locked from the outside. They fall prey to the apathy, cornered and further exhausted. RWBY, horrified to see Blake lying lifeless as an apathy is about to kill her, screams for her friend and activates her silver eyes. This stuns the Grimm long enough for the group to momentarily stun the Grimm, giving her enough time to save her teammate. The apathy screech again, and everyone collapses in exhaustion. When Maria crawls over to her, RWBY answers her question that her eyes are silver. Maria instructs her not to think of the Grimm, but of her loved ones and how they make her feel. RWBY then sits up and unleashes her powers again with more control, and destroys all of the apathy within the vicinity, shocking herself and the others over the extent of her powers. They then escape from the cellar and find Crow passed out from drinking the alcohol in the bar. RWBY urges her uncle to get up and pushes him out of the house with Weiss's help. They then quickly get on the flatbed and escape from the farm estate. On the road, Maria tells the group that the apathy was Bartleby's attempt to cut costs on huntsmen by using their ability to drain emotions, only for the plan to backfire and the Grimm to kill all of the farmers. They learn that the apathy were affecting them as well, making them tired and apathetic during their entire stay until they escaped. After Maria laments not being able to see that the Grimm were responsible for the deaths of the farm estate residents, RWBY asks about her knowledge of the Grimm and the Silver Eyes. Maria answers that she once had silver eyes, just like RWBY. A brief respite. RWBY and the others then learn about Maria's past as the Grim Reaper and how she lost her eyes and went into hiding. As the Elder laments about her past mistakes, RWBY suggests that Maria can teach her how to properly use her powers as a silver-eyed warrior. Before Maria can reply, RWBY unexpectedly gets a call from Jean and sees that her scroll's signal is strong, realizing that they have found their way to Argus. Outside the city walls, the group reunites with Jean, Ren, and Nora, with RWBY hugging Jean and telling him that she kept her promise. While on the trolley, Team RWBY catches up on Argus's story. When they come across Saftron Kata Ark and her son Adrian Kata Ark, RWBY is overjoyed that she is meeting one of Jean's sisters. At Saffron's house, the group meets her wife, Terracotta Ark, and enjoy a dinner of sandwiches. RWBY then announces that they will ask the military base to take the group tomorrow morning, only to find themselves barred from entering the next day. RWBY and her group then meet Caroline Cordovin, a special operative in charge of the military base. Despite their best efforts, they're unable to convince the commander to let all of them passage to Atlas, with only Weiss allowed to return home. When the gates close on them again, RWBY assures Weiss that they will not leave her and that they will all get to Atlas somehow. But Crow walks away to go drink, and RWBY is unable to convince him to stay and help them come up with a different plan. When Nora brings up the possibility of Ozpin offering a plan, RWBY realizes that they need to tell Team JNPR the truth. Back at the Kata Arc house, RWBY and a group reveal all about Ozpin and Salem, leaving Jean and his teammates angered that all of their efforts have been for nothing. Ultimately, Jean pins Oscar to the wall, forcing RWBY to yell at her friend to stop attacking the farm boy. Soon afterward, everyone leaves to have time alone, with RWBY trying to call Crow but to no avail. RWBY then finds Maria sitting in the backyard and shares her sadness on how she is letting everyone down by not having a plan of defeating Salem. Then, at Maria's offer, RWBY learns of the Elder's father and how he found little information about the Silver-Eyed Warriors. When they discuss about the rarity of their bloodline, RWBY concludes that it was because Salem has hunted them down. Maria then goes on about how the power is the preservation of light, and has RWBY recall about the God of Light using his silver eyes to destroy the Grimm created by his brother. She is then told by Maria to create a state of mind that she can tap into to activate her silver eyes to preserve human life. The last bit of information leaves RWBY confused, as she recalls that her powers affected Cinder. Suddenly, RWBY is called by Yang, and Blake informs the group that Oscar has gone missing. RWBY and the others then go out to search for Oscar. When they're unable to find him, Team RWBY and Maria return to the house at night where they find Crow completely drunk on the doorsteps. Infuriated with her uncle, she and Yang pull him up and angrily tells him that they have been searching for Oscar. When Jean and his group return, RWBY is surprised to hear that Jean and his teammates are going after Atlas after they find Oscar. But suddenly, the entire group is surprised to find the farm boy back with a new outfit. Afterward, RWBY stops Crow from trying to get away from the group and listens to Jean's ideas to stealing an Atlas airship. When Crow turns down the idea, RWBY sees that her friends are completely disheartened again. She decides to hear Jean out about his plan and quickly counters Crow's rebuttal, reasoning that just because he does not have a plan does not mean that they are out of options and that they should do things their way. The Airship Heist. RWBY and the group agree to Jean's idea and formulate a plan. Weiss and Maria take over a ship after pretending Weiss would return to Atlas. But when they circle back to pick up RWBY and the rest of the heroes at a cliffside, with Blake and Yang disabling the radar tower, RWBY rebuts Crow's second-guessing, saying they could still use his skills. However, Blake's part of the plan fails as she's attacked by Adam. Cordovan personally pilots a Colossus to make an example of them, so RWBY tells Weiss to regroup with them on the ground. RWBY enters the conflict Cordovan initiated against Weiss and Maria and their stolen airship when she destroys a missile Cordovan fires at the airship. After Cordovan retaliates with an ice dust attack and Weiss protects the group, they formulate a plan to distract the operative with small targets while looking for a weakness. RWBY launches herself into the air, runs across some of Cordovan's missiles, and fails to skate and run across ice Weiss cast for them. At one point, RWBY is on the Colossus and Cordovan throws her off, leading Weiss to save her with her Lancer summon. Soon after, Cordovan destroys the summon, and RWBY misses the landing, forcing her to embed Crescent Rose into the cliffside and cling for her light. As Cordovan targets RWBY, Maria intervenes to save her. After she scales up the cliff with Crescent Rose, RWBY learns from Oscar that the Colossus's missiles pop out of the cannon, indicating that they can be detonated with an accurate shot. RWBY boards the airship to get close to the Colossus for a clear shot. But as she fires, the Cordovan counters by retracting the missiles and shooting a lightning dust blast that causes the ship to crash. Recovering, RWBY heads for the incoming Colossus as Crow stops her. Glaring at her uncle, she tells him to trust her and continues. RWBY then refuses to surrender to Cordovan and ridicules Cordovan for abusing her power just to look down on others. She offers Cordovan one last chance to stand down and hear the group out, only for the offer to be turned down and the cannon be directed to her. To everyone's shock, RWBY jumps into the cannon and aims and shoots at the lightning dust inside. She dashes out just before all of the dust explodes and destroys the cannon. With RWBY's aura broken, Weiss slows RWBY's fall, and the leader lands in Crow's arms, weak. After watching Cordovan fail to move the Colossus again, the group is shocked to learn that a Leviathan is approaching Argus. They then reunite with Blake and Yang and board the airship, with Ruby solemnly watching as Cordovan struggles to move the Colossus. On board, she assures Blake that her safety matters more than her mission, and comforts her with a hug while smiling at Yang. When Maria brings up their mission to get the Relic of Knowledge to Atlas, Ruby is surprised to hear her teammates refusing to leave Argus in danger. When they reach the battlefield, the Leviathan destroys the first shield, and the Atlesian fighters are starting to withdraw. Ruby calls them and claims that she can weaken the Leviathan so they can finish the Grim off. But to her dismay, she is denied help from the military because her group is considered hostile. Ruby presses on, directing Ren and John to cloak all of their emotions to get them past the Manticores. But they arrive too late as the Leviathan destroys the second shield, prompting Ruby to think of another plan. She then rides on Weiss's Lancer summon to get closer to the Grim. As she stops, Ruby starts to concentrate her thoughts, even throwing out her earpiece when Yang urges her to hurry. She recalls the memories of her loved ones, then remembers the deaths of Pyrrha and Penny and loses her focus. As she sees the Leviathan about to attack her, Ruby quickly calls Jin to buy more time. She frowns as the being warns not to summon her without a question, but is happy when Jin acknowledges her cleverness. As time begins to flow again, Ruby refocuses on the happy memories with her friends and family, ending on the image of her mother. She then unleashes her power and petrifies the Leviathan, but the Grim breaks its head free afterward. But to everyone's surprise, Cordovan arrives and finishes the Leviathan with the Colossus. Afterward, Ruby thanks the special operative for her help, and apologizes for the trouble she has caused. She is later surprised when Cordovan allows her and the others to leave for Atlas while the military finish off the Manticores. That night, Ruby thanks Maria for flying the airship, and happily hugs Crow as she tells him that she loves him. She then gets embarrassed when everyone looks at her in awe for her feats in Argus. Ruby quickly shifts the focus to Oscar's feat of landing the airship back in Argus, only to find out he was guided by Ozpin for a brief moment. But then they are called by Crow when they reach the outskirts of Atlas, and everyone is amazed at the structure of the floating city. Suddenly, the mood turns sour when they see the air fleet surrounding Atlas as if they are expecting an attack. From Mantle to Atlas. Cautiously, Ruby and the group decide to fly to Mantle instead of trying to meet Ironwood directly. Along the way, they leave the Manta behind, and Maria leads them through Mantle to what turns out to be Pietro Polendina's pharmacy. The heroes talk to him and try to ask to meet Ironwood. Suddenly, however, an alarm sounds, and Ruby and the group are forced to fight an onslaught of sabers. Penny interrupts the fight and finishes off the last of the Grim before sharing an oddly heartwarming reunion with the heroes. After Penny leaves to fight more Grim, the Ace operatives arrest the heroes for unauthorized weapon use, seizing their weapons and the relic, and putting them in a transport bound for Atlas. On the airship, they meet Forrest, a supporter of Robin Hill. They talk with him about Robin for a short while before they are delivered to Ironwood and released from their restraints. Shortly after that, Ironwood reveals his plans to the group while Ruby decides to withhold information about what happened on their way to Atlas from Ironwood. Later, the group, minus Crow, is led to Atlas Academy where they can rest. Start of a professional career. After completing a mission to secure the launch site for the Amity communication tower, Ironwood grants Ruby and her friends their huntsman licenses. As now official huntsmen, Ruby and her friends go through several training exercises with the Ace operatives to improve their skills. They also do huntsman missions to assist the construction of Amity Tower, defend Mantle from any Grim attacks, and hunt any loose Grim. During one of Ruby's missions to escort a supply run, the cargo truck is stopped by Robin Hill and her happy Huntresses. Robin demands to know why the supplies are going to Amity instead of being used to fix Mantle's damaged wall, but Clover Ebby dodges all her questions. Frustrated, Robin eventually lets them pass, but decides to do whatever it takes to discover Amity's sudden importance. After several weeks of rigorous training and missions, Ironwood grants Ruby and her friends a night off during election night. Ruby decides to spend her night with Nora Valkyrie and Lee Wren at the pre-election party for Robin to hang out with Penny, who is working security at the party. However, while at the venue, Ruby notices a hidden Tyrian Kalos at the party. She tries to warn everyone, but before she can do so, the venue is hacked by an outside party who disables the power to use the cover of darkness for Tyrian Kalos to begin massacring a crowd. The chaos and stampeding crowd knock Ruby into the ground where she loses Tyrian in the dark. After killing numerous people, Tyrion slips away before the power comes back on, framing Penny for the attack. The negativity draws a Grimm to attack Mantle, while Jacques Schnee comes out as victor in the election. Ruby, Nora, and Ren assist Atlas authorities in repelling the invasion while a traumatized Penny returns to Atlas. The next day, Ruby tells Ironwood of Tyrion his allegiance with Salem, and Ironwood orders for Tyrion to be found and interrogated. Later that day, Ruby and Weiss talk with Maria and Pietro as he extracts the footage of the rally from Penny's databanks in the hopes to prove her innocence to the public. He tells them of how he created Penny using his own aura, and how the altered footage of the attack originated from Penny's work throughout Mantle, suggesting a hacker is loose in the network. Ironwood and his subordinates are invited by Jacques to a private dinner party at his mansion to defend his council position. Ruby and her friends are invited along too as a precaution in case the council needs more witnesses. Before leaving, Team RWBY and Oscar discuss their suspicions of Jacques and a suspicious election victory and possible ties to the hacker and his security network. They decide for Weiss to sneak off in the mansion and search his office for clues. Weiss successfully sneaks to his office during the party and, with some help from her mother, obtains a recording of her father and Arthur Watts striking a deal for Watts to rig the election in exchange for humiliating Ironwood. Weiss shows the footage to the council, resulting in Jacques being stripped of his rank and arrested. Meanwhile, Watts, using Jacques' council credentials, hacks into the Mantle heating grid and deactivates the heat throughout the city, freezing the citizens. The public assume Atlas to be freezing them out and cause a huge riot and fire in the streets, attracting a massive Grimm invasion. With the panic Ironwood was afraid of already happening, Ruby and Oscar convince him to tell the council and Robin of Salem, which he agrees and complies with. Before the Ace operatives, Team RWBY and Team Juniper deploy to Mantle to protect the citizens and repel the Grimm. Ruby and Oscar agree to reveal the truth of Ozpin's disappearance and Salem's immortality to Ironwood, which Oscar stays behind to do. The huntsmen fly to Mantle on an airship, but are shot down by Tarek's Grimm. They split into teams of 3 to help as many civilians as possible, with Ruby being on a team with Harriet Bree and Penny Polendina. As they battle the Grimm, Ironwood releases a broadcast to Mantle and Atlas revealing the existence of Salem, her associates and their responsibility with their attacks on Beacon, Mistral, and Mantle, much to Ruby's joy. As the night continues, Ruby's team escort their group of civilians to the nearest landing zone when they're attacked by a Megaliath Alpha. Ruby attempts to activate her silver eyes but is unable to concentrate in all the chaos. Instead, she comes up with a plan to have Penny burn off its tusk with her lasers. Ruby cuts it off with her scythe and impales the Grimm with its own tusk. The plan works perfectly, and the two succeed in evacuating their sector's civilians. Fallout with Atlas. During the evacuations, Ruby and the other huntsmen suddenly receive a message from Ironwood to be recalled with zero explanation. Confused, they return to Ironwood, who reveals a Black Queen chess piece, the symbol Salem used before Beacon fell, was placed in his office. Ruby realizes that Cinder Fall was responsible upon seeing it was made of black glass. Ironwood caves into paranoia, suspects Salem was ahead of the whole time, and loses trust in Team RWBY for lying about Ozpin, Jin, and for Blake and Yang leaking the Amity plans to Robin unbeknownst to Ruby and Weiss. The meeting is suddenly interrupted by the emergence of a Seer Grimm, which was hiding in Watts' bag, and conjures up a mirage of Salem. Salem reveals she is imminent to Atlas and threatens to destroy both cities if the group does not surrender both relics. RWBY defies Salem, stating that they will stop her regardless if they can kill her or not. Salem retorts that her mother also said the same thing, but was proven wrong, causing RWBY to break down crying as the mirage fades. The Salem apparition disappears, and the Ace Ops begin to panic, especially upon realizing that the proximity alarms along the coast near Atlas are inactive. Blake asks about the readiness to launch the Amity Tower, but Yang realizes that Ironwood just said that to lure out Watts. Ironwood states that he has sent Winter to claim the Winter Maiden's powers, and that he wants to seal the Relic of Knowledge in the vault with the Relic of Creation. He tells RWBY that he changed his mind about letting Team RWBY keep the lamp because they lied to him, and because Salem is on their doorstep while everyone is too exhausted for another battle. Ironwood then explains that he intends to raise the city of Atlas into the atmosphere instead of Amity Tower. There, the city, the 2 relics, and the Winter Maiden will be safe from Salem. Team RWBY protests that this plan would mean leaving people in Mantle to die due to the evacuation not being complete, but Ironwood and the Ace Ops refuse to reconsider. Suddenly, Jean opens a group call with RWBY, Crow, and Winter. Taking the opportunity, RWBY uses her semblance to get past Ironwood and warn the others about his plan. Ironwood locks communications, declares that Team RWBY are under arrest, and leaves while the Ace Ops get ready to detain them. Harriet locks down Ironwood's office, letting RWBY decide whether they'll be arrested peacefully or not, prompting Marrow to hesitantly ask if they're really going to fight. RWBY taunts Harriet by saying the Ace Ops were the best huntsmen in Atlas until they trained her team, prompting the fight to break. RWBY bursts out of the room, causing Harriet to chase her in anger. Outside the office, RWBY tries to talk Harriet into stopping their fight and working to stop Ironwood, but Harriet brushes her off and says she didn't trust RWBY from the start. As their fight returns to the office, Harriet yells at Marrow, telling him to stop holding back against RWBY. Marrow insists that he's only trying to arrest them, and that she was taking things too far, seeming as though she wants to kill RWBY. Harriet does not deny this, and instead says it's necessary. RWBY leaves the room, causing Harriet to chase her again, where she's eventually overpowered by RWBY and Weiss due to exhaustion. Team RWBY then ties Harriet and the Ace Ops to their gravity bolas and leave them in Ironwood's office. Pietro, Polendina, and Maria catch RWBY tying up the specialists, deciding to help the Huntresses. The group makes a plan where RWBY and Weiss will catch up to Winter and the Maiden, whilst Yang and Blake find their friends to escape Atlas. RWBY and Weiss arrive at the Atlas Medical Facility, and after a battle between Winter, Penny, and Cinder had occurred over the powers of the Winter Maiden. Upon arrival, RWBY sees Cinder and instantly uses her silver eye powers, causing a frightened Cinder to flee by blasting her way through the roof. RWBY runs over to Penny, who is by the side of Freya's corpse, asking the new maiden what happened. Maria and Yang arrive on a stolen Manta airship, and Penny decides to go with them. On the airship, RWBY and Weiss comfort Penny until they intercept a broadcast from the military. Salem has arrived. Operation Amity. RWBY, Weiss, and Maria arrive at the slums beneath Atlas to take Oscar to their new base, which is a defunct restaurant taken by the Happy Huntresses. They discuss their next course of action, in which RWBY and Yang have an argument about whether or not it's worth trying to worry about the Amity Communications Tower when people are dying in Mantle and General Ironwood will never cooperate with them. Jean calms them down and suggests they go for both Amity and Mantle, and they split up. RWBY is concerned and wants them to stick together, as splitting up is what Salem wants. However, Oscar reassures her that Salem wants them to turn against each other, so as long as they are united, they are together still. RWBY goes for Amity, joined by Nora, Weiss, Blake, and Penny, while Jean, Oscar, and Ren join Yang for Mantle. Pietro tells them that Amity can only be activated through a terminal from Ironwood's office, or a terminal in a highly classified area of the Atlas Command Center. RWBY's group arrive with May Marigold at the Snowshoe shipping facility, as it is the only way they can get up to the Atlas Command Center without being apprehended, as the drones there report to the Schnee Dust Company, not the Atlas military. While there, Penny expresses her dislike that they're fighting and disagreeing with Ironwood, as they're supposed to be allies, or friends, as she puts it. She also wishes that she was simply the protector of Mantle and nothing more. However, RWBY dismisses her concerns by saying that by becoming the Winter Maiden, she did protect Mantle. Afterward, they ship their way up to the Atlas Command Center, and, once there, Penny gives the directions to the terminal room. With May's help, they make it up to the elevator and use Pietro's credentials to get access through a door. However, their mission is found hopeless once they're forced to go right through Central Command, which is packed with people, and therefore they can't go through without being spotted. May says that she can hijack a ship for them to leave. However, Penny has an idea, which is that RWBY use her semblance on everyone to pass the Central Command room and gain access while May readies the ship to leave once they've gained access. It's here that RWBY's semblance is explained. When RWBY uses her semblance, she first thinks of a destination, then breaks herself down to her molecular components, negating her mass, and then, after speed bursting there, reassembling them at said destination. Therefore, since mass no longer matters, her weapon and attire also breaks down, and therefore theoretically she can use her semblance on a person or people near her if she so wishes. May causes a distraction across everyone in the Central Command room by having a worker carrying a coffee trip, thereby causing the coffee to spill onto another worker's clothes, throwing everyone into frustration that the coffee-holding worker decided to bring coffee into the room despite there being a sign prohibiting it. RWBY uses the distraction to transport herself, Weiss, Blake, Nora, and Penny across the room and up the stairs right across the terminal room. Once in the room, the extremely thick electrified door of which was opened with Pietro's credentials, Pietro takes control over Penny's body and grants them access to Amity. However, he says that they will need Penny for the launch still, and therefore she cannot return to her friends to help Yang and her group evacuate Mantle to the crater. This saddens Penny, but RWBY reassures her that it may truly be for the best, and so Penny accepts it. As they leave the room, however, the Ace operatives show up and tell Penny that she needs to come to Ironwood. She and RWBY argue with them for a while, until Harriet manages to separate them from RWBY's group and close the electrified door on them, trapping them in while Penny is alone against the Ace operatives. Penny begins to feist the Ace ops while Weiss tries to get them out of the room through her summon. This eventually fails, however, as it gets disintegrated due to the electricity. Weiss expresses concern for Penny, while RWBY hopes her Winter Maiden powers can help her last long enough against the Ace ops. Nora, out of options, puts her hammer against the electricity generator and supercharges herself, and smashes the door open, though the process cripples her as the extreme amount of electricity broke her aura and scarred her. RWBY, Weiss, and Blake face the Ace ops coming to Penny's aid, as the Ace ops get a new message on their comms. The team charge, however, they get pushed off by Vine, and RWBY is forced to use her semblance to get Weiss, Blake, and herself onto the platform. Harriet rips a sword off of Penny and they retreat, while RWBY and her group tend to Nora and take her to the hangar where May is ready with the ship. As they leave for the command center, RWBY and Penny hug one last time, as it is time for Penny to go. The rest make their way to the Schnee Manor, where they force Whitley Schnee to let them in. Whitley is not pleased, as the house staff have all left, Willow Schnee has locked herself in a room, and the Schnee family reputation is tarnished. Weiss does not take kindly to Whitley's actions whatsoever. However, RWBY tries to be nice and tells him that they will leave once Nora feels better. Weiss orders Whitley to his room. Blake and RWBY then try to call Yang. However, she does not pick up, as unbeknownst to them, she is stranded in the tundra with Jean, Ren, and a broken bite. As Nora is placed to rest in Weiss's bedroom, RWBY sits with her teammates as they watch her message broadcast to the entire world. In her message, RWBY warns the people of Salem, reveals the existence of the maidens and the relics, and states that Ironwood cannot be trusted. She then pleads to the people to unite and fight Salem, and to not give up even if Atlas falls. Attack on the Schnee Manor. As Salem begins her invasion, RWBY watches in horror with her friends of the start of the battle through a broadcast. Later that night, she has hot drinks with her teammates as they ponder on what their next move should be. Suddenly, they are informed by May that Fiona Time has lost contact with Yang's group and wants to head back for Mantle. But with Weiss wanting to stay with her family in Atlas and the Happy Huntress arguing that they have to choose a side, RWBY intervenes, saying that there are no sides as Salem is the true enemy and that they need to stay united. Later, RWBY tries to stop May from leaving and suggests that they find Crow and Robin. But she is interrupted by the Happy Huntress stating that they have to choose to help either Mantle or Atlas. They suddenly hear a knock on the front door and are surprised to find Klein Sabin outside, having been called by Whitley to treat Nora. As she watches Weiss make amends with her brother, RWBY is alarmed by a loud crash from outside. She and her teammates hurry to the crash site, where they find Penny severely damaged. RWBY works with Weiss and Whitley to carry Penny and lay her next to Nora. As the Manor's power goes out, she receives a call from May, who had just left moments ago for Mantle. RWBY apologizes to the Happy Huntress and promises that they will do something after fixing Penny, though the reply she gets from May is that they might not be able to help with the surrounding destruction. After the call ends, RWBY becomes distraught over all of the disasters that are in front of them. She is consulted by Klein to focus on one problem at a time and start by restoring power to the Manor. RWBY later goes out with Blake to the nearby generator to turn on the power. As they wait for full restoration, RWBY laments that nothing they have tried has worked in their favor. She is then surprised when Blake tells her that her optimism and drive to do something has inspired the Faunus, and is looked up to by her teammate as a result. RWBY thanks Blake, and the power is restored, but then they are attacked by the Hound. She tries to concentrate using her eyes while her teammate covers her, but their efforts are thwarted and she is knocked out and carried away by the Grimm. While Blake tries to stop the Hound and Weiss joins them, RWBY wakes up and notices the Grimm's sight on Penny's maiden power going haywire in the Manor. Seeing that her clothes are covered in the robot's green blood, she realizes that the Hound is after Penny. Suddenly, the Grimm drops RWBY as it flies off, and she is knocked out again with her aura breaking. When Blake is about to be killed by the Centaur, RWBY wakes up and slays the Grimm to save her friend. Suddenly, they hear Penny scream from the Manor and regroup with Weiss at the entrance. They find the Hound holding Penny unconscious and threatening her life. Having enough, RWBY blasts the Hound out the window with her silver eyes, causing the Grimm to drop Penny. As RWBY and her teammates tend to the robot, they are shocked when the Hound reappears and reveals a silver-eyed faunus inside of it. The three of them carry Penny to the wall as they're backed into the corner by the Hound inching closer to them. As they're paralyzed with fear and unable to fight back, RWBY and her friends are saved by Willow and Whitley as they crush the Hound with an armored statue. She then drops to her knees as she realizes the Grimm that they just killed was a person. Ironwood's Ultimatum. Later, after Monstra is unexpectedly destroyed, RWBY learns that Yang and her group are alright through Blake's scroll, and is clearly elated to see them again. Shortly afterwards, she opens the doors of Schnee Manor to see them at their doorstep. She immediately throws herself into Yang's arms, crying at finally being reunited with her older sister. She then greets Jean and Ren, glad to see them alive as well. Though when she sees Emerald amongst them, her good mood vanishes and she instinctively reaches for Crescent Rose. But Oscar intervenes, saying Emerald is no longer on Salem's side. At that moment, RWBY gets contacted by May and Mantle, saying the ships arrived but they weren't alone, coupled with the sounds of explosions in the background. Contact is soon lost moments later. Immediately after that, RWBY and the others receive an emergency CCT broadcast via their scrolls. She watches as the SDC cargo ships are shot down by Ironwood's forces, and the general himself appears, declaring his intent to protect Atlas at any cost. He then gives Penny and friends an ultimatum: come to the academy to help him protect Atlas, or watch as he destroys Mantle, and he has a bomb to do the job. He also warns if anyone tries deviating from his terms, then Mantle will be destroyed. He concludes by saying he expects an answer within the hour. In the dining room, RWBY vents out her frustration that they have no way out of Ironwood's ultimatum, and have made no progress since the previous day. She quickly runs out to the main hallway and slumps down on the staircase in despair. When Yang arrives to talk about the Hound, RWBY quickly reveals her conclusion that Summer was turned into a Grimm by Salem, causing her sister to drop in tears. She then laments her failures for Amity, and that help did not come, but is told by Yang that they need hope and to have to take risks. RWBY breaks out into tears as her sister hugs her and proclaims their mom as their hero. Suddenly, they're alerted by Jean that Penny has awakened and is trying to fly to Atlas. RWBY quickly grabs Penny by the waist as her friends pin the robot down with their weapons. RWBY then asks Penny what she can do, but is shocked when the robot asks her friend to kill her. The Huntress's eyes widen in shock when Penny reasons that she makes sure she can pass out the maiden's powers to her. But after Nora points out that Penny is only partially a machine, RWBY thinks of the robot's human aura and yells at Jean to boost it. After everyone calms down, RWBY allows Oscar to summon Ozpin so that the headmaster can apologize to them. Seeing that the virus is still inside Penny and that she must go to the vault, RWBY realizes that the vault is something that they have not yet considered, as they can use the staff to save Penny and evacuate both Atlas and Mantle. In the dining room, RWBY listens as Weiss explains the risk of their plan. And when Oscar adds that Atlas will start to fall once the Relic of Creation is used, RWBY nervously taps her fingers. They all then learn of the spirit in the staff and how his powers work, and Weiss eventually comes up with a plan to deal with Ironwood. RWBY then calls Ironwood and coldly tells him that Penny will go to Atlas, and she receives orders from the general that the robot goes to the academy entrance alone. The ultimate risk. With the help from Klein and the Schnees, Team RWBY and Penny arrive at the hole created by Oscar when he fell out of Atlas. RWBY then uses her semblance to carry her team and the robot to the entrance of the vault. As soon as Penny opens the door, RWBY uses her semblance again to quickly get her teammates to the relic. She then grabs the staff and summons Ambrosius, nervously tells him that Penny is dying. The spirit bluntly tells her that he cannot bring people back from the dead, but RWBY denies that, saying that Penny is not their typical girl. As Ambrosius looks at Penny and explains that he will give them exactly what they want, RWBY lets Weiss show Penny's blueprints to the spirit, and explains that they want him to create a new version of Penny using her exact same robot parts. As Ambrosius questions the wording of her request, RWBY elaborates that an exact copy will include the virus, and an exact copy without the virus will cease to exist once Ambrosius creates something else. Thus, she wants the spirit to create a new body with the existing parts to take the virus and leaving Penny's soul. RWBY further explains that Ambrosius cannot destroy, but he will not be destroying Penny. But as the spirit tries to figure out what will be left, RWBY playfully replies that he just has to get creative. After Ambrosius explains that there will be risks, and Weiss replies that they don't have any other options, the spirit then proceeds to separate Penny's soul as he creates a new robot body. Team RWBY then approaches Penny, with RWBY calling out to her. After Penny wakes up and her old robot body is destroyed, RWBY asks her friend if she's okay. The now human Penny hugs RWBY, learning how warm hugs are. The team then summon Ambrosius again, asking him to create passageways from Atlas and Mantle to Vacuo. Again, Weiss provides Ambrosius with blueprints from Whitley, and Yang suggests that they use a dimension similar to that of those inside the vaults for all the passageways. Ambrosius complies with their request, but warns them not to fall off. Shortly after, inside the pocket dimension, Cinder unleashes an explosive blast, sending refugees flying off of a platform. This draws Team RWBY's attention, and they begin to fight Cinder. While Team RWBY is distracted fighting Cinder, Neo sneaks up on them, using her semblance to disguise herself. When Yang notices Neo moving in to attack RWBY, she activates her semblance, launches herself forward, and pushes RWBY out of the way, taking the hit. Yang loses consciousness. Her aura breaks, and she's sent tumbling over the edge of the platform. Blake desperately tries and fails to catch her with Gamble's shroud, and Yang falls into the void below. Penny, alerted by Blake's emotional cry, flies over to the platform and engages Cinder in a fight, while Blake furiously teams up with RWBY against Neo. Weiss, who was already fighting Cinder, attempts to lend support to Penny but is soon exhausted. The fighting in Ever After continues, and Jean stresses to Nora that their top priority is finishing the evacuation. Weiss uses her Queen Lancer summon to narrowly rescue Penny from Cinder's grim hand. Penny tells Weiss to let her sacrifice herself to protect everyone. Cinder destroys the summon while Weiss is distracted, dropping them onto the main platform and damaging their auras. Penny offers herself as a target to Cinder, trying to distract her from Weiss and the staff, but Cinder sneers, saying she wants it all. Blake jumps into the fight, and Weiss flees with the staff while Blake and Penny face Cinder. When Cinder attacks RWBY and Neo from behind, blasting the former over the edge, Blake tries to save her and catches her with flying Gamble's shroud to swing them to safety, but Cinder burns Gamble Shroud's ribbon with a fire blast. RWBY, Blake, and Neo plummet into the void. Falling into the void. As RWBY plummets into the abyss, she is attacked by Neo. RWBY holds her hands to stop Neo, but Neo decides to mess with her by changing into Oscar, Yang, and Penny before getting RWBY in a headlock. RWBY knocks Neo away, leaving the mute to glare at her as they fall into the other world, the abyss. RWBY eventually wakes up on a mysterious shore. After getting up and drying herself off, she prepares to enter the island. Did you enjoy our video? Be sure to check out these other great videos from the Amagi, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos. Videos.